What happens when one of Hollywood's most controversial figures sits down face to face with one of television's most outspoken hosts, and the conversation suddenly takes a turn that no one in the studio or watching at home expected? Moments like these are exactly why live television can be so unpredictable and so captivating. In today's story, we're taking a deep dive into the intense and unforgettable exchange between Mel Gibson and Joy Behar on the daytime talk show The View, a moment that quickly caught the attention of viewers across the country and sparked heated discussions online. Before we explore what happened in the studio that day, imagine the setting. The bright lights of the stage were shining, the cameras were rolling, and the audience had settled into their seats, expecting another lively but typical episode of the popular morning program. The hosts were preparing for what they thought would be a routine celebrity interview, one where the guest promotes a new project, shares a few behind-the-scenes stories, laughs with the panel, and moves on. But sometimes, when strong personalities share the same stage, things don't go exactly as planned. That particular morning began like many others at the studio of The View. The production crew moved efficiently behind the scenes, making sure every microphone worked and every camera angle was perfect. The audience chatted quietly, sipping coffee and waiting for the show to begin. The hosts gathered at the famous round table, exchanging casual conversation before the broadcast started. On the schedule for the day was an appearance by Mel Gibson, the Academy Award-winning actor and filmmaker known for his powerful performances and his ability to command attention both on and off the screen. Over the years, Mel Gibson has built a reputation as one of Hollywood's most recognizable figures, with films that have left a lasting mark on the industry and a career that spans decades. His presence alone was enough to make the episode feel special. However, his career has also been surrounded by controversy, making any public appearance a potential headline. For the producers of the show, that combination of fame and unpredictability meant ratings, and for the hosts, it meant an interview that could go in many different directions. Among those hosts was Joy Behar, someone well known for her direct questions, sharp humor, and willingness to challenge guests when conversations become uncomfortable. Throughout her years on The View, she has built a reputation as a host who isn't afraid to say what's on her mind. Viewers have come to expect her quick wit and bold commentary, especially when interviewing public figures who have strong opinions or controversial histories. As the show began, everything appeared normal. The opening segment featured the hosts discussing current topics in the news, sharing their perspectives with the lively energy that the audience had come to love. Laughter filled the studio, and the atmosphere felt relaxed. When it was time to introduce the guest, the audience applauded enthusiastically as Mel Gibson walked onto the stage. He greeted the hosts politely, shook a few hands, and took his seat at the table. At first, the conversation followed the familiar rhythm of a promotional interview. Mel Gibson spoke about his latest project, describing the inspiration behind it and sharing small details about the filmmaking process. The host listened attentively, occasionally asking lighthearted questions about his experiences on set and the challenges of bringing a story to life on screen. The audience laughed at a few jokes, and for a moment, it seemed like the segment would pass without any major surprises. But interviews involving strong personalities can change quickly. As the discussion continued, the tone gradually shifted. Joy Behar leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful but intense. She began asking questions that moved beyond the film itself and into broader territory topics that many viewers knew could easily become sensitive. The atmosphere in the studio subtly changed, as everyone realized the conversation might not stay as light as it began. This is where things started to become truly interesting. Live television has a unique energy because anything can happen, and there's no way to rewind or edit the moment once it unfolds. Every word spoken at that table was being broadcast to millions of viewers, and every reaction from the hosts, the guests, and the audience was part of the unfolding drama. The exchange between Mel Gibson and Joy Behar began to grow more intense as the questions became more pointed. What started as a simple promotional appearance slowly transformed into a conversation filled with tension, curiosity, and unexpected moments. The other hosts watched carefully, sometimes stepping in with their own comments, sometimes choosing to stay quiet as the dialogue developed. For viewers at home, the moment felt electric. Clips of the discussion would later spread rapidly across social media platforms, with fans and critics debating who handled the situation better and whether the questions asked were fair or confrontational. Some people admired the boldness of the interview, while others felt the conversation had crossed into uncomfortable territory. Moments like these remind us why celebrity interviews can become unforgettable when public figures with strong reputations sit down with hosts known for their outspoken personalities. The result can be anything from thoughtful discussion to dramatic confrontation. In this case, the meeting between Mel Gibson and Behar on The View became one of those television moments that people continued talking about long after the cameras stopped rolling. So as we continue exploring this story, we'll break down exactly what was said, how the tension built during the interview, and why this particular exchange captured so much attention from audiences around the world. Stay with us, because what happened next in that studio was something very few viewers or even the hosts themselves were fully prepared for. The reason for Mel Gibson's appearance on The View that day was simple on the surface. He was there to promote his latest directorial project, a powerful war drama that many early critics were already describing as a potential comeback film. For years, Gibson had been one of the most influential filmmakers and actors in Hollywood, known for directing and starring in projects that left a lasting impression on audiences. But like many long careers in the entertainment industry, his journey had experienced both incredible highs and difficult controversies. Because of that history, every new project he released carried an extra layer of curiosity and scrutiny. Some people were eager to see him reclaim his place among Hollywood's top filmmakers, while others were watching closely to see how he would present himself publicly. After years of intense media attention, the producers of The View understood this dynamic perfectly. They knew that bringing Mel Gibson onto the show would generate excitement among viewers. The combination of Gibson's undeniable screen presence and the show's reputation for bold, direct conversations made the segment feel like must-watch television even before it aired. Over the years, the program had built its brand around lively debates and fearless questioning, particularly from hosts who were not afraid to challenge their guests. When you place a celebrity with a complex public image into that environment, the potential for a memorable moment becomes almost inevitable. Behind the scenes, the producers anticipated a strong episode 1 that would spark discussion on social media and perhaps trend online for a few hours after broadcast. They expected thoughtful questions, a few moments of tension, and maybe a headline or two the next day. What they didn't expect, however, was just how intense the conversation would eventually become, or how dramatically the energy in the room would shift as the interview unfolded. In television, especially live television, there's always a certain level of unpredictability, but even experienced producers sometimes underestimate just how quickly a conversation can change direction once strong personalities begin engaging with each other. When the time came for Gibson's entrance, the studio lights seemed a little brighter, and the atmosphere in the room grew noticeably more electric. The audience, made up of fans and regular attendees of the show, had been informed that a major Hollywood guest would appear. As soon as Mel Gibson walked onto the set, the reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. Applause filled the studio, echoing off the walls as viewers rose slightly from their seats to get a better look at the actor and director. For many people in the room, this was their first time seeing him in person, and his reputation alone carried a sense of excitement. Gibson responded to the applause with the confidence of someone who had spent decades in front of cameras and audiences. He raised his hand in a friendly wave, acknowledging the crowd, and offered the kind of familiar smile that movie fans had seen in countless interviews and public appearances throughout his career. It was the same relaxed charm that had helped make him a global star in the first place. At that moment, nothing seemed unusual. The mood was upbeat, and the audience's energy suggested they were expecting a fascinating but friendly conversation. After greeting the crowd, Mel Gibson walked over to the famous discussion table where the hosts of The View were seated. The table itself had become something of a symbol for the show, place where politics, entertainment, culture, and personal opinions often collided in lively debate. As Gibson approached, the hosts greeted him politely, offering smiles and brief introductions before inviting him to take his seat. Among the hosts present that day was Whoopi Goldberg, one of the most recognizable figures on the panel and someone known for her calm but authoritative presence over the years. She had often taken on the role of guiding discussions when conversations became heated, sitting nearby was Sarah Haynes, whose conversational style tended to be more curious and friendly, often bringing a sense of warmth and relatability to interviews. Together with the rest of the panel, they formed a dynamic mix of personalities that made the show's discussions both unpredictable and engaging. As Gibson settled into his chair, the cameras adjusted their angles, capturing the entire panel. As the audience gradually quieted down, the applause faded, replaced by the focused silence that usually follows the beginning of an important interview segment. The hosts exchanged brief glances with one another, an unspoken signal that the conversation was about to begin. At first, the questions were exactly what viewers might expect from a promotional interview. The host asked about the inspiration behind Gibson's new war drama, how long he had been developing the project, and what audiences could expect from the story. Gibson responded thoughtfully, explaining that the film explored themes of sacrifice, courage, and the emotional toll of conflict. He spoke about the challenges of directing a large-scale war film and how important authenticity was when portraying soldiers and historical events on screen. The discussion seemed smooth and professional. The audience listened closely, occasionally reacting with soft laughter or applause when a comment resonated with them. On the surface, everything appeared to be going exactly as planned. But beneath that calm exterior, there was a subtle tension that many experienced viewers of The View had come to recognize. Whenever a guest with a complicated public history appears on the program, the conversation can shift at any moment. The hosts have built their reputations on asking the kinds of questions that other interviewers might avoid. While the early portion of the segment focused on filmmaking and storytelling, it was clear that the discussion could easily move into deeper territory. As the cameras continued rolling, the producers in the control room watched carefully, monitoring every moment of the conversation. They could already sense that this interview might become more memorable than they had originally predicted. The combination of Gibson's candid responses, the host's curiosity, and the attentive audience created an atmosphere that felt increasingly charged with anticipation. For viewers watching at home, the scene looked like the beginning of a classic talk show interview, a major celebrity promoting a new film while sharing insights about his career. Yet those familiar with the personalities involved knew that things could change quickly, with strong opinions around the table and a guest whose life and career had been the subject of intense public debate. It was only a matter of time before the discussion moved beyond simple promotion. And as the hosts prepared their next questions, the studio audience leaned forward slightly, sensing that the conversation was about to enter a much more interesting and possibly uncomfortable phase. What had begun as a routine appearance to promote a war drama was slowly transforming into a moment of television that no one in the room would soon forget. As Mel Gibson settled into his seat at the round table on The View, the energy in the studio seemed to shift slightly. The audience had just finished applauding his entrance, and the sound gradually faded into a quieter, more focused atmosphere. As the hosts prepared to begin the interview, for viewers watching at home, it looked like a typical start to a celebrity segment. But inside the studio, every expression, every small gesture, and every tone of voice carried meaning. Several of the hosts greeted Gibson with warm smiles and polite enthusiasm. Whoopi Goldberg, seated near the center of the table, leaned forward, slightly with the calm professionalism that had defined her years on the show. Beside her sat Sarah Haynes and Sunny Hostin, both of whom offered friendly nods as the cameras focused on the group. Their expressions conveyed the welcoming tone the program typically tries to maintain. When introducing a guest, but one host stood out from the rest, Joy Behar leaned back in her chair. Her arms crossed across her chest. Unlike the others, she didn't immediately mirror the warm smiles being exchanged around the table. Instead, her expression appeared sharp and intensely observant, the kind of look that suggested she was already evaluating the conversation before it had even truly begun. To anyone familiar with her style on the show, this posture was not unusual. Joy had built a reputation over the years for being one of the most direct and outspoken voices on the panel. The contrast between the host's reactions created a subtle tension that attentive viewers could notice. On one side of the table, there was open friendliness and curiosity. On the other side, there was a more skeptical, guarded presence that hinted the discussion might not stay entirely comfortable. Breaking the brief silence that followed Gibson's arrival, Whoopi Goldberg spoke first. Her voice carried the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to guiding conversations on live television. "Welcome back to The View, Mel," she said with a friendly smile, addressing the guests directly while also acknowledging the audience watching at home. "It's great to have you here to talk about your new film." Her words were simple, but they served an important purpose. As one of the senior hosts, Whoopi often took the lead in establishing a positive atmosphere at the start of interviews. By greeting Gibson warmly, she set the tone for what appeared to be a professional and respectful conversation. Mel Gibson nodded appreciatively, leaning slightly toward the table microphone as he prepared to respond. Years of interviews had made him comfortable in this environment. Despite the bright lights, multiple cameras, and the watchful eyes of a live audience, he appeared calm and composed. "Thanks for having me," Gibson replied. His voice carried the unmistakable sound of his Australian accent, which remained noticeable even after decades of living and working in Hollywood. That accent had become part of his identity, something fans recognized instantly whenever he spoke in interviews or public appearances. Gibson's tone was polite but relaxed, as though he understood exactly what kind of environment he had stepped into. Appearances on talk shows like The View were often a mixture of friendly promotion and unexpected questions. For a public figure who had spent years navigating both praise and criticism, that unpredictability was nothing new. He paused for a moment before adding a comment that drew a few amused smiles from the panel. "It's always interesting coming on shows like this," he said. The remark sounded casual, almost playful, but there was an underlying hint of honesty in it. Anyone who followed daytime television knew that The View had built its reputation on lively debates and candid discussions. Guests sometimes found themselves facing questions that went far beyond the topic they had come to promote. Gibson continued, with a small shrug and a half smile. "You never know what you're going to get." The comment sparked a ripple of laughter from the audience, and a few of the hosts smiled at the remark. It was the kind of line that acknowledged the show's unpredictable nature, without sounding defensive or confrontational. In many ways, it showed that Gibson was prepared for whatever direction the conversation might take. Still, while the studio audience reacted positively, not everyone at the table seemed amused. Joy Behar remained leaned back in her chair, her arms still crossed. Her expression didn't change much after Gibson's remark. Instead, she watched him carefully, as though studying every word and every reaction. For viewers familiar with her approach to interviews, that posture signaled something important. Joy often listened quietly at the beginning of a segment, allowing the conversation to develop before stepping in with her own perspective. And when she finally spoke, her questions tended to be direct and impossible to ignore. The other hosts, meanwhile, continued maintaining the friendly atmosphere that Whoopi had established. Sarah Haynes nodded politely, appearing genuinely interested in hearing more about Gibson's new film. Sunny Hostin offered a brief smile, glancing between the guest and the rest of the panel as the discussion began to take shape. From the outside, the moment looked simple, a guest being welcomed onto a popular talk show. But inside the studio, the dynamic between the personalities at the table suggested that the conversation might not remain purely promotional for long. Live television has a way of revealing subtle tensions that scripted programs never show. The camera captures every glance, every pause, and every change in body language. And in this case, the contrast between the host's welcoming tone and Joy Behar's reserved posture hinted that something more complicated could unfold. Meanwhile, Mel Gibson appeared aware of the atmosphere around him. His expression remained calm, and he maintained that easygoing smile that had helped him navigate countless interviews throughout his career, whether he was discussing filmmaking, acting, or personal experiences. He had always known how to keep a conversation moving forward. Yet even as the segment began with polite greetings and light humor, the feeling in the room suggested that the interview might soon move beyond simple introductions. The hosts of The View were known for their willingness to ask difficult questions, and Gibson himself had hinted at that reality, with his remark about never knowing what to expect. For the moment, though, the conversation remained calm. The audience listened attentively, the cameras continued rolling, and the hosts prepared to guide the discussion toward Gibson's new project. But the subtle tension lingering at the table suggested that the interview was only just beginning and that the real conversation was still waiting to unfold. As the conversation at the table continued, the atmosphere inside the studio of The View began to change in a subtle but unmistakable way. At first, the interview had followed the typical rhythm of a celebrity appearance: polite greetings, light jokes, and the familiar back and forth between hosts and guests. But moments like these can shift quickly, especially when strong personalities are involved. While the other hosts maintained relaxed expressions, Joy Behar slowly leaned forward in her chair. Her posture changed from the earlier arms crossed, distance to a more engaged, deliberate stance. It was a small movement, but one that immediately drew attention from the people sitting around the table. Her eyes narrowed slightly, focusing directly on Mel Gibson. For viewers who had watched the show for years, this shift in body language was a familiar sign. Joy often listened quietly during the early part of a conversation, allowing the guest to settle in before she began asking the questions that might push the discussion into deeper territory. When she leaned forward like that, it usually meant she was about to say something that would change the tone of the interview. "Oh, I think you know exactly what you're going to get, Mel," she said, her voice calm but unmistakably sharp. The words themselves were not shouted or dramatic, but the meaning behind them carried weight. It was the kind of statement that immediately transformed a friendly interview into something more serious. Instead of simply welcoming the guest and talking about his new project, the conversation had suddenly taken on a tone of challenge. Joy continued, her gaze steady and unbroken. "The question," she added slowly, "is whether you're prepared to handle it." The sentence hung in the air for a moment, creating a pause that felt longer than it actually was. In television studios, even a few seconds of silence can feel incredibly intense, especially when millions of viewers are watching. Round the table, the reaction was immediate but restrained. Whoopi Goldberg shifted slightly in her seat, her expression thoughtful, as she glanced briefly between Joy and Gibson. She had moderated many tense conversations during her years on the show, and she could recognize when a discussion was beginning to head in a more confrontational direction. Nearby, Sarah Haynes blinked and adjusted her posture, her polite smile fading just a little as she processed what Joy had just said. She didn't interrupt, but her reaction suggested that she, like the audience, was aware that the interview had just crossed into more uncertain territory. Sunny Hostin also looked toward Joy, her expression thoughtful and attentive. She appeared curious to see how the exchange would unfold, but she remained silent, allowing the moment to develop naturally. The audience in the studio reacted in a quieter way. Earlier, they had laughed and applauded, but now their energy shifted noticeably. A few people in the crowd exchanged glances with one another, unsure whether to react or remain silent. The comfortable atmosphere that had filled the room only minutes earlier was replaced with a kind of cautious curiosity. Some audience members shifted in their seats, the small rustle of movement echoing faintly in the studio. Even though nothing overtly dramatic had happened yet, Everyone could sense that something significant might be about to unfold. Behind the cameras, the crew members were just as aware of the change in tone. The camera operators, who were used to following the rhythm of live television, adjusted their focus carefully. One camera zoomed slightly closer to the table, capturing the expressions of both Joy and Gibson. Another shifted to a wider angle, ensuring that the reactions of the other hosts would also be visible. In the control room, producers watched the monitors closely. Moments like this were both exciting and nerve-wracking. On one hand, intense exchanges often created memorable television that audiences talked about long after the show ended. On the other hand, live broadcasts left very little room for mistakes or misunderstandings. Back at the table, Mel Gibson did not immediately respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as though considering the comment carefully. His expression remained composed, but there was a thoughtful intensity in his eyes as he studied Joy's face. For a brief moment, it looked almost like a silent standoff. Joy's gaze remained fixed, steady and unwavering, while Gibson observed her calmly, trying to read the meaning behind her words. To anyone watching closely, this pause revealed a lot about both personalities. Joy's posture suggested that she was prepared to ask questions that might challenge her guests directly. Gibson's calm reaction, meanwhile, hinted that he was used to navigating complicated interviews and was unlikely to respond impulsively. The silence between them lasted only a few seconds, but it carried a sense of anticipation that filled the entire studio. Around the table, the other hosts waited, allowing the exchange to continue without interruption. It was one of those moments in live television when everyone instinctively understood that stepping into quickly might break the natural tension that had just formed. The audience, too, seemed to lean forward slightly, curious about what Gibson would say next. Some viewers might have expected him to laugh off the comment, while others wondered if the conversation would turn into a serious debate. Meanwhile, Joy maintained her steady gaze. Her expression suggested that she had something specific in mind, something she wanted to address openly rather than avoiding it with polite conversation. For Gibson, the situation was familiar in many ways. Over the years, he had faced countless interviews where difficult questions appeared unexpectedly. Public figures often learn to read the room quickly, sensing when a discussion is about to move from friendly promotion into more personal or controversial topics. And at that moment, it was clear that this interview on The View was no longer just about a film. The tone of the conversation had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. What had begun as a routine appearance to promote a new project was gradually transforming into a much more intense exchange, one where the questions might become sharper and the answers far more revealing. As Gibson continued to study Joy's expression, preparing his response, the entire studio seemed to hold its breath. Something significant was about to happen, and every person in the room, hosts, crew, and audience alike, could sense that the interview had reached a turning point.